This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
We do here have a speaker, Chris Jury, who has got a hugely impressive CV, which you can Google if you're keen. But he's here today to talk about whatever he feels like talking about, really. But around the idea of culture, I think, is what we're going to hear. He's going to talk for 45-50 minutes, and then we'll have a discussion about what he's said and see whether or not we agree with him. That's the format. So if we could turn the light off so we can see the screen. Thank you. Over to you, Chris.
Thank you very much. So, my name's Chris Jury. I'm not a historian. I'm here because I do know John Usinger for my sins.
Yeah.
And in fact, what I'm going to talk to you about today came out of a joint paper that I did with John for a conference in Brighton. Because I'm a writer mainly, playwright. I'm a playwright mainly. I've just had a reading of a play called Nadia, which is about Stalin's wife, Nadia Aliyeva, who fought Stalin very hard and ended up killing herself when she realised there was nothing she could do. And that's been there's been a lot of historical research involved in writing that play. And then earlier this year I did a play called The Liberty Tree, which was more inspired by theatre history that came from the work of Erwin Piscator and Brecht and that lot in the 1920s. So we could talk about those things at the end if we wish to as well. But what I'm going to basically do here is put to you an argument, so a polemic, which you'll either have or you won't have. John Usinger put the alternative view when he did the paper with me, but he's not here, so we can start off. And my basic tenet here is that one of the things that the left in the post-war period has forgotten is the importance of culture generally in bringing about social change. And I don't mean the value of culture, art for art's sake value of culture. I'm talking about the value of culture as an instrumental tool. This has been well known, especially by people on the right, and is called propaganda elsewhere. And I will argue that because of the Cold War and the very effective use of propaganda, both in the Soviet Union and by the Nazis, that the idea of propaganda became discredited as an idea. Indeed, the whole of the post-war British culture was all about. We ended up with abstract art because, in reply to the propaganda, especially of the Soviet Union and social realism and the instrumentalism that involved, that abstract art came about directly as a response to that, to say we're free and look, we can do this, we can do this that means fuck all, but isn't it free? And that then played into the 60s, but we'll get to that in a minute. Let's just, this is an argument, it's not detailed historical research, if that's what you're expecting, because I'm not a historian, so you'll have to live with me on that, and you'll have to buy the general principles or not. So when we say culture, we talk about creative activism is the phrase that I use, which includes theatre and films and all sorts of things, but includes graphics. that is political graphics. Very straightforward political graphics. All power structures have always known the power of this, from the ancient Egyptians going back, who would, ancient civilizations built monuments hugely and partly as a way of conveying ideas and of the power of the people involved. And people don't recognise that this actually is is propaganda. So we've got lots of these images that we see in our culture which assert power, where power lies, who has the power, and that this power is legitimate. And then we see people messing with those symbols, because people sometimes, occasionally, historically, people recognise that these symbols are the symbols that they are, and they start to mess with them. And we see people just messing sometimes. In that case, it's just the messing with it. It doesn't carry any political message in a direct sense, but the political message is, I don't buy this. The structure, the power structure, I don't buy. And people just, they get a laugh, and they get a laugh particularly from this audience because, we question these structures and authorities, and indeed, in some audiences, a thing like that people would be angry, especially in this week, because what we're talking about here is that, which is the defending of the country in the First World War, and the bravery and patriotism of those people involved. So even to mess with this in these sort of silly, inconsequential ways is to say something much more, which would be demonstrated by the anger of certain people, that would be demonstrated because you've messed with this, as was demonstrated by the anger of that. I mean, that song, God Save the Queen, created rage in people. It was a 3-chord pop song. What's going on? And the people who wrote it were spat at in the street, vilified across the media, because all they'd done is do a song called God Save the Queen, which was taking the mick. But it was powerful. It made people angry. There's something going on here. The two great symbols of the hegemonic power of our era. And again, people just mess with them, just for the sake of it. People just mess with them. So, my basic argument is that revolutions are as much culturally inspired as they are politically inspired. My basic argument is rests on the idea of what some people have called oppositional consciousness. Traditional theories of social change and revolution especially rest on economics, and they claim that when things get bad enough, people respond and we get struggle. I think there's obviously manifestly some truth in that, but it's not the whole story. And I would say that it's far more important, or certainly as important, to create oppositional consciousness as it is for the economic conditions to be right. And later on, I'll lay out the argument now, and then that'll give you all time to tear it to pieces. But my main historical example of this is the 1960s. The 1960s in America and in the UK, we had literally never had it so good. The welfare state was very successful and effective. We'd had economic growth since the end of the Second World War. We literally had never had it so good. And yet, both in America and in the UK and in much of Western Europe, it was the period of the most rebellious period in our history. there was as much industrial unrest as there had been in the 1920s. There was, in France, there was 1968, the summer of 1968, and, people seriously thought, briefly, that for about a fortnight that capitalism might collapse in Western Europe. It was literally for about 24 hours, but nonetheless, it was powerful stuff, and yet it was at a time when we had never had it so good. And in fact, I would argue that, in fact, one of the reasons it happened then was because we'd never had it so good, because people weren't afraid of unemployment. And indeed, part of the argument of Margaret Thatcher when she came in, and the argument that the left have used against Thatcher, is that she introduced systemic institutional unemployment of about 2 million in order to create enough fear in the workforce to impose austerity and neoliberalism on that workforce. And I think there's some truth to that, and that actually one of the reasons why so much happened during that time was because we'd never had it so good and people weren't afraid. But it was also because oppositional consciousness, for about 15 years, 65 to 73, around that period, oppositional consciousness became cool. This hasn't often been the case in history, but for about 15 years there, to be anti-establishment, to be rebellious, to be revolutionary was cool. So my argument would be that oppositional consciousness is the feelings that lead to oppositional consciousness are always there. People are always feeling pissed off at work and being told what to do. They're always pissed off by poverty, by being observed and measured and by the forces and powers that be. But that actually what we need to develop is oppositional consciousness. The other part of the argument is that the right wing have always known this. I mean, Hitler in 1922 wrote that propaganda is absolutely crucial to doing what he wanted to do. He knew it. He wasn't powerful. He was in prison at the time, writing Mein Kampf, and he was writing that propaganda was absolutely crucial to what he wanted to do. He understood that. And I think we've lost it. So what do I mean by oppositional consciousness? I mean three things: that the current regime is illegitimate, that there are credible alternatives, and that the current regime can be defeated. So one of the things we hear people saying all the time, or have heard up until the Corbyn phenomena, but what we have heard people say increasingly is, we can't win. There's nothing to be done. Yeah, they're all bastards, but what are we going to do? It's the way it's always been. There's nothing to be done. We can't change anything. So that's an important part of oppositional consciousness, is giving people an impression, an idea that actually it could be changed. There are either the power or the mechanisms in place to change it. That there has to be an alternative. I think the most successful cultural narrative, the meme, that has been the most successful of those in the last 30 years is the teen narrative. There is no alternative. I think that's been hugely persuasive to people. To vast numbers, millions and millions of people have accepted the idea that there is no alternative. They obviously haven't thought about it for 5 minutes, I'll give you that. But nonetheless, I would say that's been a hugely important narrative. And that the current regime is illegitimate. That's the basic that people have to recognise. Hang on, where have these people got their power from, and how come they're telling us what to do? How come they got all the money? What the fuck's going on? Rather than, it's meant to be this way, it's a legitimate way. You know, many people, if not most people in our middle classes, believe in some sort of meritocracy. They believe that their privileges are due to their skills and their talents, and that they are therefore legitimate. Their privileges are therefore legitimate. I don't buy that, or if I do, I think it's much more complicated than that. So, and of course, the other idea that is central to this thesis is perpetual revolution, i.e. it's never over. I would probably describe myself more of an anarchist than as a socialist, in the sense that I don't believe everything will be all right in the world if you socialists got in power. Frankly. No offence meant. But I'm not sure everything would be honky-dory in those circumstances, because I think, you know, as we've seen historically, a new elite would be created and similar to some of the same shit would happen again. So that actually what we're in is a constant battle between them and us, between power and not power, and that this has been going on forever, since human beings first started to come together in cities 10,000 years ago. It's been going on since then, and it'll be going on forever, and there's nothing to be done about that. So as I say, a sort of politico-economic determinist view would argue that really the 1960s shouldn't have happened, couldn't have happened. I mean, interesting, I'm not an expert, I'm not a historian, but I'm aware of the fact that actually the 1930s, which are generally regarded as a very important period in trade union history and rebellion, actually the 1930s, because of the Depression, the Great Depression, but the 1930s, in fact, from 1920 onwards, trade union membership decreased throughout that period. And that actually the period of greatest trade union stuff and rebellion throughout Europe was the period just prior to the First World War, which generally speaking isn't, in our narrative of our history, that isn't generally described as the period. People talk about between the wars, but actually it was on a decline after the First World War. But anyway, some theories of capitalism start from a similar position as a Marxist position, start from a similar position, i.e. that economics is the substructure, and that everything else is an addition to that. Now, I don't buy that. I fundamentally don't buy it. I don't think that that's how societies work. I think societies work firstly and foremostly through culture, and that it is culture through which we exchange ideas, through which we I think if I were to write a play saying what I'm saying now, it would have both more effect and there'd be more people listening to it, hopefully, than if I were to write a paper about it. Because actually the way societies in general exchange ideas is not through prose written thesis. That's how academics exchange ideas. It's not how the society exchanges ideas. The way society exchanges ideas is through television drama and theatre and books. That's how people exchange their ideas and find out what's socially acceptable, and what, you know, when you're teaching, as I was for a few years up until recently, when I was teaching in a university, one of the things that is clear, especially, for example, about young women, is that they've got ideas of what it is to be in love from films, from romantic comedies. So they've developed their ideas of what it is to be in a relationship with another, in a romantic relationship, from films. Not from their parents or watching other people, but from films. And they have expectations about those relationships which are based upon those cultural experiences that they've had. So propaganda we don't need to spend too much time on that. Obviously, I think we all know what we think propaganda is. So, right from the beginning, there he is, old Adolf with Mein Kampf. So, one of the things that's we talk about the anti-Semitism of the Germans and the anti-Semitism that was around at the time. If you look into it, I would argue that anti-Semitism in Germany that allowed the Holocaust to take place was created, and it was created through propaganda. That picture there is an illustration from a children's book. So we're talking about young children and their parents reading these books to them, which are telling a very particular story. This didn't just arise, it was created, and it was largely created culturally. Yes, there were economic situations going on, but once the Nazis were in power, there was, this was a propaganda campaign that was at the level of children's books, at the level of comics, at the level of popular culture, absolutely base level, posters, putting the idea, very clear idea, of the Jew as the evil other. Now obviously they were hitting a nerve, and they did it very successfully and managed, and went a very long way with this. But the argument is that this was as much culturally created as it was economically created, if not more so. And the images are quite extraordinary and quite startling. In Russia we had the opposite case, where in the Soviet period the worker as a concept was glorified, and this is very, very well documented, and I'm sure all of us here, being of a certain age, are well aware of the way this was used, and it used at the same time as the regime itself. I mean, this particular one's hilarious. To do with the agricultural collectives, bearing in mind that 15 million people died in order to collectivise agriculture, while at the same time those 15 million starving people were being glorified in the culture. One of the other big factors in the way that this works, and it still works less so in our society, is the glorification of the individual, as we saw with Stalin and So, neoliberal propaganda. What do I mean by neoliberal propaganda? I think we've been living, we have been living for the last 30 years in a period of neoliberal hegemony, and that this is conveyed to us all day, every day through the popular culture. Commercial advertising, people say, well, what are you talking about, commercial propaganda? And you say, well, every day we are surrounded by neoliberal propaganda, which is saying buy some shit, and if you buy some shit, it'll make you happy. Buying some more shit will make you even more happy. And that'll make you happy. This is neoliberal propaganda, and they're spending billions and billions on it, they're pumping it out all over the place, it's never ending. The X Factor, I think, is a really important one. The X Factor has one central idea, which a lot of this neoliberal propaganda has as well, has one central idea which can be summed up in the sentence, it could be you. So this is a sort of meritocracy argument that I mentioned earlier, which is saying it could be you. It could be you. Now, to young people especially, this is incredibly persuasive, because actually I used to teach on an acting programme, and nobody on the course should have been doing an acting programme, let alone anything else. But I couldn't say to any of them, you're wasting your money. because it is theoretically possible that any one of them could have made it. And this is very persuasive to them, because I can't say, there's enough shit actors around making millions. You know what I mean? Talent's got fuck all to do with anything. So they could make it. So it could be you. This is very, very important to making people keep slogging away. All these kids on these 0-hour contracts who aren't fighting who aren't starting a revolution over it. All these kids are on it because they think that one day they won't be, and that one day they could be rich and wealthy beyond their wildest dreams. Employability agendas in education. Those of you who are in HE know that this has gone on for certainly the last 10 years, and it's getting worse and worse and worse as the idea of us as democratic citizens is being entirely replaced with the idea of students as that what university is doing is training passive workers rather than training thinking citizens. And that's very, very persuasive. It's absolutely accepted by a lot of the kids themselves. So if we're going to bring about a period of, if we're going to fight this, and we need a lot of people to help fight it, to get mass movements, we've got to change the thinking, and we've got to fight this neoliberal propaganda. So this propaganda, use of creative activism's gone on all the time. Throughout history, there's been the governments, the power structure has put forward their cultural objects to assert their power, and people have subverted that throughout earliest times. One of the earliest ways of doing it, because it was easy to do, was the song, the political folk song that's been going on, for over 1,000 years. And then once newspapers came along in the 17th, 18th centuries, the political cartoon became very popular, and these cartoons had a huge effect, and they were instrumental, I would argue, in changing the consciousness of the public, especially around the royal family, around who was legitimately in power, and they were very important. They played a huge part in the movement against slavery, and the portraying black slaves as people through culture, through books, through stories, was hugely important in changing the attitude of the majority of people to slavery. There's a few of these are just a few examples now of stuff that's going on now. There's an outfit in Canada called Adbusters, which you may or may not be aware of, this is their sort of raison d'etre. Adbusters, this is their speciality. Very famous picture there, cut and paste Photoshop job, which I think says as much about Blair and the war that you could take 10,000 words to say. In a prose piece, I think that picture is incredibly powerful in what it conveys about the ideas. This is the famous Adbusters flag, which I've just got, which again I think very cleverly these symbols. These symbols are the symbols of corporations. So these stars of the states. cracker. So these are simple. Banksy, of course, our own Banksy, who manages to convey, I think, fantastic ideas in very, very simple images, challenging, subversive ideas, and is hugely popular as a result. So, this period of 1960 to 1973 that I was talking about. So, economically, it was one of the most fantastic periods in British history and in America. And I think a number of things came together in the Cold War, in this period. The Cold War and the relentless freedom discourse of the Cold War. I mean, during that period, there was no way that a government in the West would have suggested the type of surveillance of internet and what, I mean, we didn't have internet, but there is no way during that period that a Western government would have suggested the levels of surveillance which are now being suggested, and the holding people in prison for 28 days, and all of this stuff would never ever have been suggested by a Western government in that time, openly, because we were the good guys. And the evil commies were the people who did that type of thing, and we didn't do that type of thing. And I think it is an interesting, the cultural shift since the end of the Cold War into now, where Western governments no longer feel the need to do that, has been quite extraordinary, I think. The African American Civil Rights Movement. I would also argue that rock and roll itself was hugely important in this period, in this oppositional consciousness, because rock and roll, in and of itself, was subversive. Rock Around the Clock. What are the lyrics of Rock Around the Clock? That, they're not. The lyrics aren't subversive, but the style of the music, the dancing, the whole thing. When the film that Rock Around the Clock came out was on in cinemas in the UK, kids went mad and tore the seats of the cinema up, tore them to pieces. The whole ethos of the thing was about rebellion, partly because it came from it was picked up by white youths and had come from a black culture. And so the rebellious power of black music itself. And certainly by the end of the 60s, to be a rebel was cool. To be white and have black friends was cool. Even to be black was cool. I mean, this went on. The black thing went on. And now even in our culture, we've got white kids talking as if they're black kids. Deliberately, to be cool. And so oppositional consciousness was, for this brief period, the hegemonic cultural way of expressing yourself. To be patriotic was naff. To be obedient, to be straight at school, it's not cool, man. And so, in this period of great economic growth, to be angry, rebellious, and defiant was the height of cool. So, I've basically finished the main spiel now. I've just given you some more bits and bobs. So, the protest song, I think, has been and continues to be hugely important. There's a quote from Joe Hill at the top there, and I think it's the core of the argument, is that people are, I would argue that people are driven to try and bring about political change more by emotion than they are by their intellects. The sense of injustice, the sense of powerlessness, these emotional responses are far more important than analysis of economics. People's existential feelings about where they are. And rebel songs are a fantastic way of expressing that, and always have been, and they've always gone on. Rebel songs in working class culture from, the first one on that list is from 1381, the Peasants' Revolt. This has been going on. People have been expressing this amongst themselves, their dissatisfaction, and they can be incredibly powerful. Amazing Grace is a protest song, Amazing Grace, which has sort of become very, mainstream, but it was written as a protest song. The Internationale, the Red Flag, which, these songs have been hugely important to people. And the cultural moments when, people stop singing the Red Flag. When did people stop singing the Red Flag? When did that become about? These are hugely symbolic. They're not just symbols. They're hugely emotional things which are empowering to people. If anyone who's interested, there's an amazing book called 33 Revolutions Per Minute, and that's just a list of some amazing songs. Billie Holiday's Strange Fruit, which is an amazing song. I'm sure you all know it. Taken from the photograph of the lynched black guys. So these songs, and what the quote from Joe Hill says at the beginning is that these songs hit the heart and the mind. And the reason why I think culture is such a powerful force is because it's hitting you at both levels. It's hitting you, you're getting the idea, but you're also getting the emotional power of it. So, do you want to turn the light on? So my premise, the reason why I bother making this argument is because I think it's not understood largely on the left. There's a sort of idea that a bit of political theatre is quite nice. Yeah, it's all right. We all like seeing them ban Billy Bragg and all that. It's all very nice. But it's just an addition. It's just an additional. It's just a added extra. It's not important. What's important is everybody sitting in meetings and talking and that. And I don't buy it. And I think we've missed a trick. And I think they know it. They're very, very good. One of the things that they do, it's not quite the same as culture or things, but the news to most people is part of our cultural life. We'll get it through the telly and our newspapers. And one of the fantastic things that you have to give the Tories the credit for is that they have a message and they just keep saying it. On any given day, they just keep saying it. It's one of the reasons why we all get so pissed off them, because they're not answering the question, they're just saying what their message is. But when you watch them across the media, different people across the media, they're all saying it. They're all saying the same thing. They understand the power of the message. And for some reason we don't. I think it may be something to do with the Cold War, or maybe to do with the influence of a sort of economic Marxist theorizing, which said that these things are just a substructure. They're a result of Whereas I think there's a much more dialogic thing going on there. I don't think these things are just a result of economics. Economics is a result of these things and vice versa. That there's a dialogue going on, and that culture is how we express that dialogue as societies. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much.